Before the jury filed into the courtroom today to hear testimony in the case of the people of the state of New York versus Donald J. Trump, Judge Juan Merchan issued his ruling to the lawyers of what would actually happen to Donald Trump if he were to testify in his own defense in this trial. Now, of course, before the judge issued his ruling about what evidence the prosecution would be allowed to use to attack Donald Trump's credibility as a witness, there was absolutely no reason to believe Donald Trump was going to actually testify in his own defense. Donald Trump is incapable of telling the truth, and that would become quickly obvious to the jury, who would probably find themselves watching Donald Trump commit perjury and probably concluding that they were watching him committing perjury. So there really was no chance that Donald Trump was going to testify. But here is what the judge ruled the prosecution could bring up if Donald Trump were to take the witness stand. The judge said that the prosecution could bring up the fact that, quote, the defendant was found to have violated executive law, Section 63, by fraudulently misstating the value of his assets for an economic benefit. That's the Attorney General's case in New York. And that, quote, the defendant violated a court order by failing to remove an untrue, disparaging, and personally identifying post about the court's principal law clerk from the website donaldjtrump.com. The court fined the defendant $5,000. And the prosecution would be allowed to use the fact that, quote, the defendant was found to have intentionally violated a court order by making public attacks on the judge's law clerk, despite 2 prior court orders not to do so. The court fined the defendant $10,000. The judge also ruled that prosecutors would be able to bring up the fact that, quote, the defendant was found to have defamed E. Jean Carroll in public statements in 2019 by making false statements with actual malice. And that, quote, the defendant was found to have defamed E. Jean Carroll in public statements made in 2022 on Truth Social by making a false statement with actual malice. And the prosecution would be allowed to confront Donald Trump with the fact that, quote, the defendant stipulated to the dissolution of the Donald J. Trump Foundation to resolve claims by the New York Attorney General that he engaged in repeated and willful self-dealing transactions. So there really should be no suspense tonight about Donald Trump testifying in his own defense. He could not possibly survive questions about E. Jean Carroll, his public attacks on court personnel, with jurors sitting there in the room with court personnel, wondering if Donald Trump is going to attack those court personnel or those jurors themselves. And then there was another powerful indication that Donald Trump cannot testify in his own defense today. And that was when his defense lawyer testified for Donald Trump, saying this: I expect that you will learn that when Ms. Daniels threatened to go public with her false claim of a sexual encounter with President Trump back in 2008, that it was, as the people just said, very close to the election. And it was almost an attempt by Ms. Clifford, Ms. Daniels, to extort President Trump, to which the prosecutor said objection and the judge sustained. So there's Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer saying that Donald Trump never had a sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels, which Stormy Daniels has publicly described in detail. Donald Trump was alone in a hotel room with Stormy Daniels, while Donald Trump's wife was home with his 4-month-old son at the time. The only people who can testify about what happened in that room are Stormy Daniels and Donald Trump, not Donald Trump's defense lawyer. And Donald Trump is not going to testify. There will never be a moment when Donald Trump sits on that witness stand and says, I did not have sex with Stormy Daniels. And so today, Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyer did it for him. Todd Blanche tried to get away with testifying for Donald Trump in his opening statement by saying that Stormy Daniels' description of her sexual encounter with Donald Trump is false. According to Stormy Daniels, who has spoken about it publicly many times, it was a sexual encounter that did not last long, and that in the pre and post sexual chatter, Donald Trump, among other things, compared Stormy Daniels to his oldest daughter. Stormy Daniels has given us plenty of detail about that. The essence of the Trump defense is that the $420,000 that was paid to Michael Cohen was paid for legal services having nothing to do with Stormy Daniels. Donald Trump's criminal defense lawyers told the jury, quote, "You will hear that he, Michael Cohen, did legal work for President Trump and the First Lady as his personal attorney. You will learn that each month in 2017, Michael Cohen sent an invoice to some of the employees at Trump Tower right here in Midtown for $35,000. And on this invoice, Michael Cohen described his work as payment to the retainer agreement for legal services rendered. The invoice was processed. Somebody at Trump Tower generated a check. The check was ultimately signed, and there was a record in a ledger on President Trump's personal records that reflected the invoice. For 9 of the checks, the check made its way down to the White House, and President Trump signed it. You'll hear that he's the only signatory of his personal checking account, which is why he signed the check. So what on earth is a crime? What is a crime about what I just described? The prosecution's answer to that question was that it was all, quote, a planned, coordinated, long-running conspiracy to influence the 2016 election to help Donald Trump get elected through illegal expenditures, to silence people who had something bad to say about his behavior using doctored corporate records and bank forms to conceal those payments along the way. It was election fraud, pure and simple. The prosecutors said, quote, "We will never know, and it doesn't matter if this conspiracy was the difference maker in a close election." And then the prosecution revealed a communication on election night 2016 between Stormy Daniels' lawyer and Dylan Howard at the National Enquirer, who was part of the conspiracy to suppress negative information about Donald Trump. The prosecutor told the jury, "You will also see evidence that on election night, as news outlets got closer to calling the election for Donald Trump, Keith Davidson, he was the lawyer for both Stormy Daniels and Karen McDougal, texted Dylan Howard at the National Enquirer, and he said, 'What have we done?'"
Hey everyone, MSNBC has a new and improved app. You'll get real-time alerts and analysis, live blogs, in-depth essays, video highlights, and the best 2024 election coverage. Download the new MSNBC app. Here's how to do it. You tap on the App Store on your phone. You hit search on the bottom right corner. You type in MSNBC. You click on the MSNBC app. You click on Get or the cloud icon and enjoy it.